Welcome to all of our attendees, and thank you so much for joining tonight or today, depending on wherever you are. We're sad the symposium is not in person this year, but a nice thing about Zoom is that we can bring in people from all over the world. So it's wonderful to have you all. I'm Lauren Ashbrook, and I'm one of the co-organizers of this panel on farm innovation for resilience. This is the second panel of the second day of the Yale Food Systems Symposium, which goes through Friday. So please check out our upcoming panels and events this week. But this panel is here to really feature farmers and those who work closely alongside them. We want to consider how the adoption of innovative on-farm practices has increased the resilience of their operations along several dimensions: ecological, financial, even social and cultural. We will be together for between 75 and 90 minutes, starting off with a moderated discussion and then moving into audience Q&A. So I just want to point out the Q&A function in Zoom, which you all should be able to use to enter questions as we run through the panel. And you can also upvote questions if you like other folks' questions and want to see those answered. And with that, I will hand over to Charlotte.
Wonderful. Yes, we're so excited to have you all with us. And after the panel, we're going to have a debrief, informal chat session with interested attendees and some of the panelists. That's going to be in a separate Zoom room. And so we're going to put the link in the chat at the appropriate time. So please be on the lookout for that. And please feel free to join us there to keep a great discussion going. And so with that, let's kick this off. It's my pleasure to introduce our moderator, Jessie Deelo. Jessie founded Deelo Consulting Services to design and execute sustainable sourcing programs for suppliers and food companies. Building off her career as a commercial farmer, extension researcher, and industry program director, she develops metrics-based impact programs to baseline and advance sustainability outcomes for farmers, suppliers, and food companies. Ms. Deelo has sector experience in North American dairy, grains, oilseeds, organic, and regenerative ag. She also has experiential knowledge of small to mid-scale horticultural production. Her graduate school training in international agricultural development from UC Davis shapes her approach to supply chain sustainability for global markets. And we're so lucky to have her with us. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Jessie.
Great, thank you. And welcome everyone to our session about on-farm innovation for resilience. Thank you for that kind introduction, and thank you for the organizing team for inviting me here to moderate the discussion this evening. Before I introduce the panel of farmers and researchers, I want to take a couple minutes to kind of level set about what we're talking about and why. Resiliency is something we talk about a lot these days, and there's a bunch of different ways we can think about resiliency. I think for our purposes for this discussion tonight, I'd like to suggest a really simple definition. So let's consider resiliency as the ability to endure hardship, learn from that experience, and adapt our behavior to be more ready for the next challenge. You know, to have more tools in our toolbox, to have more people and different kinds of people to rely on when we need help. And for some of us, just knowing when we need to ask for help. The last 18 months, presented so many examples of where we can see our systems stressed and failing. We could talk about the breakdown in the meat supply chain last year. We could look at as recently as last week in Texas with the power grid failing. We can talk about children and their experience of heightened anxiety and depression under the conditions of this modern era. And of course, we will continue to examine the challenges of the pandemic has put on our healthcare system, our public health institutions, our schools, working families, women, Black and Brown Americans. And I think all of these challenges show us that our systems are vulnerable and they're cracking under the stress of COVID, of climate change, and of the cultural shifts that our systems have failed to keep up with. However, the silver lining in all that is that at the same time, we're seeing example after example that reinforces how resilient people are. In agriculture specifically, the last few decades of policies and market forces have driven massive consolidation and concentration, monopolies, and the power is held by just a few agencies and entities. It's creating this scenario where our systems are not resilient, our supply chains are not resilient. And there's this growing concern about the ability for our agricultural system, for our farming communities, for our food system to overcome these challenges that are going to be presented to us with climate change. And how are we going to face food insecurity? But of the communities of people that have demonstrated the resilience over the last few years and decades, I think farmers have proven their ability to adapt and evolve. And US farmers are facing some really difficult challenges today. Market prices are really low, costs of production are increasing. Farms have to get bigger and more efficient in order to break even. They rely on government subsidies to remain profitable. And we could think of 7 ways to Sunday that we can criticize farmers for all the things they are not doing in terms of environmental stewardship. But the fact that we still have 3.4 million people that are willing to show up and do this work under these conditions is a truly remarkable thing. So today, let's highlight the work of these 3 farmers, these 3 people who have endured the hardship of dairy markets, livestock markets, and commodity crop production. Because the fact is that most of our farmers today are still enduring hardship. They're working to become resilient, stay in business, improve efficiency and productivity just to make ends meet. And while food companies and consumers are pushing forward on sustainability and regenerative ag agendas, it's really important that we talk about how this paradigm shift is nearly impossible for the vast majority of farmers, given our policy landscape and the market forces that are really working counter to our desired goals for clean water, healthy soils, and climate change mitigation. So at some point, we do need to keep evaluating the structural challenges that we face and how are we going to use those to pivot from an agenda of efficiency and productivity to sustainability and regeneration. So for today, let's focus on these 3 farmers in front of us. Let's understand from them how they are working towards resiliency. I want to learn from these farmers who are the exception to the rule, who have gone truly against the grain in their communities, to better understand how we can drive innovation and accelerate the possibility of a regenerative agricultural future. So I'd like to introduce everyone today, and then we'll get into some of the questions. So starting with Christy Bland, is a 4th generation farmer in Tunica County, Mississippi. She has been farming primarily soybeans and rice for the last 7 years with her dad, James Bland, and with the last 5 years also being a full-time postgraduate school. Her family farm is currently around 1,400 acres with thoughts of expanding in the near future. She's a board member of the National Black Growers Council, representing Mississippi at large, a volunteer for her local 4-H club, and a deputy commissioner for Tunica County Soil and Water Conservation District. She was recently named as one of America's Best Farmers and Ranchers 2021 by Progressive Farmer. Zach Smith is a farmer and agricultural retail business owner from Northern Iowa. Over the last 10 years, he has transitioned his family's farm operation and business in a direction that promotes soil health and resiliency. And in 2020, this journey culminated in the development of an alternative regenerative production system that dynamically integrates livestock and crops in the field at the same time that he calls stock cropping. Caleb Smith milks 60 Jersey cows on 350 acres in the Taconic Highlands of southern Vermont. The farm has been zero-till since 2012, growing a rotation of corn silage, perennial grass, legume hay, small grains, and soy. Additionally, we're lucky to have 2 researchers working directly with farmers joining us tonight, and they are focused on understanding the decision-making process and incentivizing regenerative practices. So I would like to introduce to you Dr. Linda Prokopy, who is professor and department head in the Department of Horticulture and Landscape Architecture at Purdue University. Dr. Prokopy is an interdisciplinary social scientist who is recognized nationally and internationally for her work incorporating social science into the field of agriculture. And finally, Steve Rosenzweig is a senior soil scientist at General Mills, where he leads research and outreach programs across North America to support farmers in implementing regenerative agriculture and to better understand how regenerative systems impact the environment and farm economics. Steve started at General Mills in 2017 after receiving his PhD in soil and crop sciences from the Colorado State University. Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us tonight. So I would like to start with the same question to each of the farmers. And that is, why do you farm the way you do? Let me see. I'm going to pick on Zach.
Oh, thank you for including me this evening. This is it's an honor to be on this panel. Why do I farm the way I do? The way I farm has been an evolution over the last 10 years. I started in 2010 and have taken over my father's operation and shifted toward conservation, integrating strip till and cover crops, which is has been somewhat of an anomaly here in northern Iowa. There's a lot of wide scale tillage, and I think I'm the only grower in my county that actually uses cover crops on all my 100% of my acres. And so the reason I was asked here to come tonight was this project I started last year called stock cropping. And the realization I came to a year ago right now when we came up with this idea is that even though I was doing a lot of things around conservation and soil health and resiliency, the reality was it wasn't enough to really be something that was significant and a step change. And so that's what pushed me in this direction to really get outside the box and think about how can we integrate livestock and row crops back, because we have completely separated that here in Iowa, and it's a broken system. And I wanted to come up with something that was a solution to that, and really try to design something that is a truly regenerative system that isn't just a greenwashed name title that we throw on it, but something that we can really point, quantify that we're making a difference instead of slapping a label. So that's why I do what I do.
Thanks, Zach. Christy, can you tell us why do you do what you do?
The way that I started with sustainability just was to try to keep the land for future generations and not keep just taking and taking and taking from the land. It's definitely been a process, because I feel like the generation before me hasn't really taken on to sustainability as much. Mine are still small steps, not as much as like what Zach was saying, just participating in USDA programs like CSP, which is Conservation Stewardship Program, and that work on nutrient management. And we do some border strips so we can decrease the runoff. We've done some cover crop, but not 100%. But this year I'm working with a company out of Memphis called Ag Launch to start with some startup companies to see what they have to say about cover crop and moving forward with that. So yeah, just trying to teach the generation before me a little bit about sustainability, learn more myself, and then be able to pass it on for future generations so that it will be sustainable.
Thank you for that. Caleb.
So I guess I farm the way I do. It was as much just trying to suit the practice to the place as anything else. I mean, federal and state incentives have a lot to do with type of conservation practices that I'm involved with, just because it's if they're paying, you know, we're signed up and joined up. And then, you know, the tillage thing was, I came to this farm in 2010, and the stones range in size from a baseball to four-wheeler or Volkswagen Beetle. And so it didn't take very long for me to think, whatever management challenges there are going to be with zero till, that's got to be easier than picking rocks for weeks at a time.
Yep. And I also farmed in the Northeast, and yeah, cars out of the field. I don't think if you're in the Midwest, you can really understand what we mean, but it's whatever you're thinking, it's that times like a million. So yeah, I think you guys have addressed some really interesting issues that, you know, Linda, I hope we can touch on this with you. I want to do one more round of the farmers before getting to that, but you know, I'm hearing you're identifying a broken system and you want to be active in making some change, preserving the farm for the next generation, and farming within the context and the constraints that you have in front of you, and trying to maximize the resources that are available. So when you reflect on what's it's taken to get you where you are today, you know, what are the challenges that you've had to overcome? And if I can start with Christy this time, please.
I think for me, one of the challenges is just the lack of knowledge of exactly what it meant to be sustainable. I grew up on a farm, but we just think about like as a child, you're just doing whatever's asked of you, or just planning, harvesting, you're not really thinking about what you're taking from it. So I think that was one of the challenges for me, just to learn what it meant to be sustainable and what it was going to take to be resilient. Another thing I think was access to land and credit. As a young farmer, especially as a fourth generation, you just kind of really go on the generation before you, what they've been able to get. And it just takes a whole another level of knowledge, I feel like, now than before. Like, they were just really good farmers, but now you have to be, you have to make the most of land, because you have the land that you have, and make it the most profitable and sustainable, because land is one thing they're not making any more of, yeah, those are kind of some of the things I had to overcome, not just coming back to the farm, but learning what it was going to take for me to continue this legacy.
Yeah, and I think, there's a much broader discussion to be had about access to land for Black farmers and Indigenous farmers, and the challenges that people of color are facing in agriculture around land access and credit access. I think that is a much broader context and challenge that makes whatever you're experiencing different and unique and far more challenging than what we're seeing elsewhere. Caleb, can you talk about what challenges you've had to overcome? It's hard to be in dairy at all these days, and it's really hard to be a small farm. So I'd love to hear more about what you've overcome.
Yeah, so there are definitely some small dairy challenges. Probably one of the big things is we have Jersey cows, which are about, if you do the math, they're about 20% more efficient per pound of milk solid produced. So when that's your biggest expense, that's sort of a big help, even though for many years they were not popular. But with component pricing, which is how we get paid for milk in the Northeast, they've sort of seen a renaissance. And there have been some other challenges. When we started to do no-till stuff, the technology was pretty widely designed and adapted for the Midwest. There was a lot of experimentation in New England. When I started to do that, I don't think there was anyone in the county who was doing it consistently. A couple people tried back in the dark ages, gave up. And so a lot of on-farm experimentation and equipment / hardware dialing in. I mean, we've tried a lot of parts and pieces and have something that is pretty good now. And then you just have the typical New England challenges of weather and terrible labor markets. So that just sort of adds to the mix of how are you going to pull this off, kind of.
Yeah, thank you for that. And for folks that don't understand the jargon, component pricing means there's tiered pricing levels based on butter, fat, and cream and milk, and so it's based on a milk quality indication. Zach, in the heartland of Iowa, trying to go against this grain, what are the challenges that you've overcome?
So I'll be honest, I've had a pretty easy path into farming and acquisition of land, because work 100% family owned acres, so I don't have a lot to complain about. But as far as my path into sustainability, it was definitely a challenge, even with my own dad, trying to get him. There's definitely a generational component to, I've done this for 40 years and what do you know, type of thing. And you want to risk everything with tight margins to change. And farmers in general are very much a herd animal, and they do not like to stick out. And if there's black sheep in the herd, you really do stick out. In the first couple of years, I stuck out like a sore thumb. It's a little bit, it's not as lonely now, but when you venture into these things, there's not a lot of help from big ag or universities or anything. You really truly are on your own, or the networks of farmers that are innovative like you. And with the onset of social media, that's been incredibly important, I think, for more people to have their world be bigger than what it would have been before those times, to have strength in Facebook groups around, or, you know, people you meet on Twitter. And so that's, you know, that kind of fear of being alone, that's probably been one of the biggest things. And I think that's one of the biggest things that keeps a lot of people from jumping into this space.
Before I go to you, Linda, I just want to kind of touch on that question of farmer networks and being connected, because I think we hear this a lot. You know, Caleb, is that an experience that you share? You know, do you have folks that you connect with and learn from, or at least just, you know, can talk about what's going on?
Yeah, you know, there's I'm not far from a little dairy pocket in Vermont, the Meadowy Valley, the epicenter of which is a small town called Paulet, which has probably some of the best soils in the state. And so, yeah, there are people there that are they're doing some things. You know, Extension's been really good about trying to network people, and they have been very helpful with technical questions. They didn't always know the answer, but they always were willing. Somebody was willing to put the time in and do the research. But it's, you know, it's when people have been doing something in one way for a long time, it is tricky to change, even if it's, you know, at some point you just have to say, I'm going to try this, and it may flop, but like what I'm doing is not sustainable in any sense, you know?
Yeah, fair enough. Christy, what about you? What's it like where you live and in the industry you work in?
I feel like I have a lot of people that I could pull knowledge from. I'm also the board member for the National Black Growers Council, which is a group of row crop farmers. And so a lot of the people in that group are progressive, because the membership is from like Virginia down to Florida, back over to Texas, kind of like the majority of our members in the old Cotton Belt. And we have field days and annual meetings where they pull people from USDA, specifically like NRCS, and talk about sustainable practices. And then at the field days, we try to pick farms that are currently using conservation practices on their farm. So that has been really helpful to see that there are other people that are, you know, we're not where we need to be, but we're getting there, you know, just implementing small things year by year.
Cool. Dr. Prokopy, if I could shift over to you. So, you know, these farmers, they're the exception, they are not the rule. And I'm kind of curious, does your research on farmer decision-making reinforce what you're hearing from Christy and Zach and Caleb? And, you know, what's making it so challenging for farmers to pursue the kinds of sustainable regenerative systems that these folks are doing today?
Yeah, so it definitely supports a lot of our research, and I'll start with networks. So we know through research that networks are very, very important, right? We also know from research, Zach's point about being sort of the odd person out in a farming community, right, and being the first person to trial something, it can be really important who that person is. Right. So one of my favorite stories, this is from many years ago in a watershed in Illinois, we were doing some work, and the first farmer who adopted livestock fencing, so keeping livestock out of the stream, was a sheep farmer. There are not a lot of sheep farmers in Western Illinois, right? That one farmer probably set back the adoption of livestock fencing by the cattle farmers by several years, right? Because nobody wanted to be like the sheep farmer. The sheep farmer wasn't respected. So it's very, very important, right? Who's in the networks, what the norms of that community are. The other thing I thought was interesting, when you asked all the farmers why they farm, right? And what motivates them to farm the way they farm, you'll notice none of them said to make money, right? Now, they clearly all want to make money, or they would not still be farmers, because, you know, it has to involve making money. But what we found in our research is that farmers have different identities, right? And some farmers, when you ask your question, will say, I farm for a living, right? I farm to support my family. And those farmers have a very different attitude and outlook on the types of conservation practices that we're talking about, right? Because their motivation for farming is very differently driven. And so Caleb, Zach, and Christy are sort of the the leaders of the conservation movement, right? Because they are very driven by protecting the land and innovating and doing the right thing. I'm not, and I always have to couch that, right? I'm not saying other like farmers who are primarily motivated by money are not trying to destroy the land, right? It's just a different focal point, which leads to different types of decision making. And so the second part of your question was what's working and what's not working in agriculture. And we talked about this a lot earlier, but there's a lot that isn't working, right? The fact that, Zach said he's the only farmer in his county in Iowa that has cover crops on 100% of his land, right? We know from the science that cover crops are, especially in the Midwest, right, are really good at making farms more resilient. They're good at protecting soil. They're going to be great, as the climate continues to change, right? They help keep moisture in the soil. They help buffer against different types of climate impacts. So why aren't they being adopted more broadly, right? And we can throw money at the problem, but I don't think money is, well, I know money is not the only answer, right? Farmers often need some financial support to try these practices because they do cost money. But we know that just throwing money at a problem, at this particular problem, is not enough to solve it, right? There's attitudinal shifts that have to happen. There's cultural norms that have to shift. And there's a lot of work ahead of us to really do that. And that's enough for now.
Thank you. And Steve at General Mills, y'all are working hard on this to try to shift what we're seeing. So I'm kind of curious, does what the farmers and what Linda say resonate with what you're seeing from the perspective of a soil scientist at a food company? And how are you using your position in the marketplace to support resilient farms?
Sure. Yeah. So, to date, I think we've seen ourselves as enablers, and we're really trying to, this is a movement where there is increasing adoption every year. It's just really, really slow. And so I think what we're trying to do is be enablers and accelerators, really trying to convene and fund partners in these, local communities where we source key ingredients for our products, to really figure out, what type of different approaches, combinations of resources are going to be most helpful and meaningful for accelerating the adoption of these systems. And so a lot of the things that we're piloting are a lot of the things that I heard from all these folks. There's, I think the number one thing, Christy talked about just how she's trying to learn about these new practices, right? Like getting that knowledge is a cost in and of itself, the time that it takes to learn about these things. And some, in cases, the money that it takes to kind of experiment and the risk you take on when trying these new things. So, we're trying things like cost share, technical assistance, lots of education. We've heard too about the social, isolation that comes, and we know farmers learn best from other farmers. So really trying out different ways of creating peer networks where farmers can really kind of learn from each other, like what we heard here. So, a lot of these pieces are coming together in combination, and it's going to look different based on, these different communities where we're at and the types of local organizations that are there. But really, we're trying to invest in those local groups that are going to be there for a while and really grow their capacity to support this movement longer term. So lots of, getting, new technical assistance folks trained to help farmers in the area, implement these systems and kind of coach them down this path. But we're also looking at things like economic incentives. There is a sector of the farming base that is just naturally motivated to go in this direction, and we definitely need to help them get there faster. But there is a huge swath of farmers that just haven't really engaged with trying these new things, and so we're looking at, can economic incentives be a component of that, or part of a more holistic set of resources that can help them make these transitions? And then, to your point about cultural shifts, one thing we've heard is just that, like, when a food company like General Mills comes into a place and says, like, regenerative agriculture is an important thing, like this is something that we stand behind as a company, and like a well-recognized name, and we've got field signs out saying like the General Mills Regenerative Ag program, and the farmers see that stuff. We've heard from the farmers in our programs that's really started a conversation, started changing people's minds, and at least just raising awareness for folks that it's not on the radar, right? And so I think, we're interested in unpacking that a bit and seeing how we really start those conversations and maybe some of this cultural or attitudinal shift. Yeah.
Thank you. And we do have a lot of food companies, leading the charge on this. They want to do more in their supply chain. It's very complicated. And Steve and I know each other from work that we do, where I work with corporate food companies as well. It's a long supply chain and it's pretty opaque. But there's a big effort to develop these ecosystem service markets. Carbon markets are talked about a lot in the context of regenerative agriculture. We're going to try to avoid some of that tonight. But I do want to understand from the farmers, when we hear about these things, when you hear about these market-based solutions to driving sustainability, like you sequester carbon, we'll pay you a carbon credit, or you save, you reduce synthetic nutrients onto your land and that reduces runoff, and we will see improved water quality downstream, and we can figure out how to create a credit and you can earn extra revenue that way. What are your reactions to these market-based approaches to sustainability? And I'm curious, as you kind of started down this journey, did the marketability of your products as sustainable or regenerative or climate friendly kind of factor into your decision making, when you're thinking about the broken system and the next generation and meeting the, creating a farm system that's matched to your needs? So if we could kind of spend a little bit of time talking about that market-based approach to sustainability and the farmer's perspective on it. I think Caleb, I'll start with you this time.
Yeah, so it is not really, it hasn't been a huge factor, although there's a small amount of product that we direct market ourselves. We direct market maybe half a dozen or 8 beef animals every year out of a farm stand here. So there's kind of, but behind those products, there's sort of a story, and part of what you buy when you buy that is, okay, here's a small herd of cows. This is what these people do. Like, it's excellent quality, and it's taking care of this beautiful place. But besides that, the market-based stewardship and conservation stuff hasn't been a huge factor. Although I'm all for it, because the longer I do this, the more I realize that more of our income is going to come from non-commodity sales. It's going to come from doing different conservation things, or doing, and if that's like what we need to do to keep farming and keep this thing going, I'm totally willing to play ball with
that. Zach, what's your thinking around market-based approaches to driving sustainability?
A couple of years ago, I would have said they're awesome, and that's exactly what we need. But I don't know that I'm there anymore, and because these things come and go, and I don't see it really shifting the needle. And there's been things proposed in Iowa for some of these incentives, and it helps. It maybe gets some doors open, but as soon as those things are taken away, it's back to the status quo, and it really doesn't have change that sticks. And so I think these things can be a part, but I am skeptical of some of these things as far as how effective they're going to be as far as driving it. And I truly think the only thing that is going to be meaningful in imposing change is from a situation where it really hits people where it counts, and that is specifically around crop insurance and availability and the subsidy levels that are applied toward that. And that's not very popular in farm groups or farm circles, but if there's 2 things. You have to influence landowners, number one, and if farmers only have 1-year leases with landowners, and there's no incentives for them to make sure their tenants, if they're in a rental situation, do these practices. So I think there needs to be something around taxation on landowners if their tenants don't align with that, and I'll just be as blunt to say is from a taxpayer subsidy on crop insurance, you need to take that away to put that true risk. If you're not going to comply, if the society is going to invest in you, you need to be doing these things. And those are the things I think that, I mean, that'll wake some people up, but that's going to take a lot of courage on the policy side to drive something like that.
Yeah, and for those that aren't kind of deep in this space, crop insurance is a big rabbit hole to go down. But I think the big factors that maybe would help contextualize what Zach is saying is that the amount you make in crop insurance is dependent on last year's yield. And so you are motivated by yield to maximize your de-risking this year's crop. And so you can see that self-perpetuating cycle where you're not managing for stewardship or you're not managing for soil health that might mitigate the impacts of too much rain or not enough rain or other situations. The other case around crop insurance is the ability to access operating loans. Because if you're growing a commodity crop, the bank knows that you have access to crop insurance. And so they feel like there's less risk by providing an operating loan to a farm that can maximize their crop insurance. Christy, what's your reaction to this kind of market-based approach to sustainability, and does it factor in your decision-making?
Here where I am in the Mississippi Delta, there is not hardly any talk of market-based approach to sustainability. I don't feel like any of the farmers around here really use that in their decision-making. They use more sustainability as a tool to, increase their yields and, to get government payments, but there's no really market-based approach here.
I think that's fascinating. I think we should just kind of notice that in the Midwest, this is a very common conversation that we're having all over, in almost every county in the upper Mississippi River Basin, where there are very, very large farms.
Mm-hmm.
But we don't talk about it in the Southeast, where we have more diverse owners, smaller land ownership. I think that's something we should just be aware of and noticing.
Mm-hmm.
Linda, you see this come from a national or global perspective. What's your take on the ability for these market-based solutions? Are they adequate to drive change for the vast majority of farms? The ones that are not here sitting on panels or going around the country presenting. What's your take, and why isn't this going to work for most, or why will it work for most?
Well, so one thing market-based approaches have going for them that government support to help farmers adopt practices don't have is that a lot of farmers are skeptical of taking money from the government, which is of course ironic because most of them take money from the government in the form of subsidies. But they don't want money from the government as a reason to not sign up for conservation programs that help them have. I muted myself. The market-based approaches are non-governmental programs, right? So that has a definite advantage to some farmers. I think I don't know if they'll be effective or not. We haven't seen, honestly, in our research and conversations with farmers, we haven't seen real interest, right? I think it's definitely at the policy level, there's a lot of interest. I think the bigger question we need to ask is, what are those markets really paying for? Right? So if we are paying farmers, for example, to use no-till and cover crops on their farmland, and every year they do that, they get paid, and they're theoretically sequestering carbon, right? Which is a global good to do that. But then at the end of 3 years of getting payments to do that, they then turn up the land and release all of that carbon. What have we really paid for? And I think a lot of the problems with a lot of the markets programs, the government kind of programs, is we're sort of tinkering with a broken system and putting some band-aids on, right? So putting cover crops on predominantly corn, soybean rotations in my part of the world and Zach's part of the world, and things like Zach's doing, right? Reintegrating livestock, which could really make a difference. We're not talking about a whole lot. Like, it's being talked about a little bit, but we're really still prioritizing the band-aid solutions, not the Let's actually fix the system.
Jessie, I think you're on mute.
You did, yep.
Thank you for that. I want to go back to the farmers and just ask you all, does what Linda say resonate with you? Do you see what your neighbors are doing kind of in the way she's characterized this opportunity? So yeah, I'll go back to you, Zach.
What about my neighbors? What's the question again?
Do you think that these market-based solutions, which maybe not work for you or don't interest you, what are your neighbors doing? I'm trying to get a sense of the broader community, where they are at.
Yeah, if they're not interested in this space, no, I don't think it, for somebody that's doing stuff conventionally, they may read about it, but it's not going to turn them on. At least what's been proposed, the dollars aren't significant enough. And I don't know, to be honest, I don't know how these food companies can, how it works out for them to pay somebody $100 an acre, which that would be something that would get somebody's attention, but that's just not feasible. And to the point of the 3-year commitment and then going back to normal, that happens all the time.
Mhm.
And I see it. I mean, I sell cover crops. And most of my customers are derived from people that get it basically for no cost through EQIP or CSP programs, and they do it for the first year, and then they get their funding cut back to half. They do half the acres the second year, and the third year, even if they're successful, they don't keep doing it because there's no money for it. And so that's where I've become kind of a cynic in this space as far as the carrot approach. Because, like in Iowa, we've had the Iowa nutrient reduction strategy for the last almost decade now. And, they rule out all the math and they lay it out for everyone. And at the end of the day, 10 years later, we've got 4% of the state in cover crops, so that's what I have to say about that.
Yeah, and I think that exact same strategy says we still need to reduce by it's either 45 or 70%, even after 10 years. So yeah, I think helping understand how other people are going to engage on the conservation ag practices is going to be a long road. Christy, what do you see? What do you think is going to help people around you engage in conservation ag?
I just think more education on it, they read about it, they see some of the benefits, or they get the payments for 3 years and then they stop. But I think if they would just stop to do like soil samples and do the research behind it and see what exactly they're benefiting from it, and just kind of take themselves out of the equation sometimes to think that, hey, this is benefiting me, but it's going to really benefit my children or my grandchildren who are farm after me. I think that'll be, beneficial.
And Caleb, I think the same question to you, and also in the context of dairy, which is a highly regulated industry. For those that might not be as familiar with it, probably not for an operation like Caleb's size, but once you get to a certain number of animals, you are required to have nutrient management plans, and all these other regulations kick in around water, manure management. It's a highly regulated system. But even with that, I don't think the dairy industry is known for its leading on conservation ag practices. But, what's your experience, and do you think, what's it going to take to convince some of your dairy peers or farming neighbors to consider these kinds of practices?
So this is pretty interesting because I live not far from the New York border. Some pretty substantial differences in Vermont farms and New York farms. State of Vermont has been very aggressive at paying for for paying for these kinds of practices. And does it, are you putting money in your pocket? Well, probably not. But if it's a wash, I'll take that wash. If someone's going to pay me to pay for my cover crop seed, and then maybe you cover the fuel for the tractor to put it in, hey, that's a good deal because the benefits are pretty obvious. And yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I live in I'm a small farm in a small state, but I mean, I have to have a nutrient management plan. Regulation is transforming the dairy industry in the state of Vermont for sure. Just because Lake Champlain is close by, a huge tourist draw. It gets dirtier every year. There's a lot of reasons for that. It's probably not all ag. I'm sure it's not all ag. And it's probably that the water's a lot warmer than it used to be. But yeah, it's coming. It's just in the 11 years I've been here, the difference is amazing as far as how involved the state is in what you're doing.
And Linda, can you speak to, that carrot versus stick, way of thinking? Because I think most farmers are pretty nervous about being overly regulated because there's often not an economic incentive. And yet, the economic incentives aren't sweet enough to pull folks into the system. Can you speak to that?
Sure. It depends on the part of the country that you're in, right? Whether you can even have a regulation conversation. I will say in the Midwest, threat of regulation often motivates farmers, right? We'll do something because then if we do a little bit of something, the government won't come after us. Regulation is effective in Chesapeake Bay, for example, right? There is regulation and it is quite effective. I think, Zach alluded to the Iowa nutrient management strategy that after 10 years, there's only 4% of the land in cover crops, right? It's pretty clear the voluntary is not working. Mm-hmm. But regulation is a really dirty word in farm country. And so I think there are ways to do it, but it needs to be done really carefully. Crop insurance was alluded to earlier as potentially a mechanism, right? So it wasn't mentioned that crop insurance is heavily subsidized by the federal government, right? Which is a really key component of crop insurance that the general public probably doesn't know, right? And so if we're heavily subsidizing someone to purchase crop insurance and then they are, not farming in the best way, right? I think doing things like taking away some of those subsidies is almost a little easier and sounds less like regulation than saying you have to do this thing or we're going to fine you, right? So I think there are ways that we probably should be having that conversation, but it's very, very challenging.
Absolutely. And I think that there's a lot of farms out there who feel like they've got a target on their back, that, folks don't understand what they do every day. They don't understand how they do steward resources in the land, and farmers often feel under attack. And I think then we have everybody in a defensive position, and we're not bringing the people to the table that probably have the solutions. And I think that is the really importance of maintaining 3.4 million farmers and bringing more in, because we need people at the table to bring their innovative ideas, because that's where we're going to find the real solutions that can be applied across the landscape. And I want to turn to Steve for a second, and being mindful of Steve is a soil scientist at a food company. He's not on the marketing department, so kind of putting you on the spot here. But I think there's always this question of like, well, where's the consumer? Like, who's going to care? Who's going to pay for this? But connecting consumers to these like very real, complex, layered challenges that we're trying to manage for in our supply chains and our ag systems today is really hard. And they don't understand, nor should they have to understand, about soil health or ecosystem functions, but we do need to engage the supply chain. So from the work that you do, can you help us understand how actors along the supply chain need to collaborate so that we can convince consumers of the value and perhaps a higher cost of food grown under these regenerative farming systems?
Yeah, I mean, like you mentioned, not quite sure how we convince consumers, but I think, what is happening is that we're on a journey with consumers, and there's no such thing as like the consumer, right? There's like lots of different kinds of consumers. And some of them, especially like those that buy a lot of organic food, they are highly educated, engaged, motivated by things like sustainability in their purchasing decisions. It's a small sector of that community, but, like General Mills, our organic brands, they're the ones that are really kind of out front talking about these things and helping to kind of educate the consumer and bring them along in this journey and engage them in this extremely complicated topic. It's harder to think about how we engage that like mainstream consumer, but there's a lot of different ways in, and that's kind of the things that we're testing. It's like, what resonates most with each of these different kinds of consumers and what is the kind of the authentic way in for different types of brands to show up. It, it could be around supporting farmers or rural communities. It could be around water, biodiversity. It could be about climate change and carbon. It could be about something else that is somehow related to this topic. So we have to find that kind of way of engaging that consumer if they're going to first understand that food comes from a farm. I think that's where we're starting with a lot of consumers. And second, that there's issues that need to be solved. And third is that farmers are out there doing it, and you can support them too. So that's kind of the journey we're on. And it's just going to take some time, and we can't wait until consumers are ready to start having an impact now. And that's really why we're like, I think there is a lot of opportunity within the current system to make a lot of change. And it is, mindset shift. I mean, I think a lot of the reason why some of the things haven't worked in the past is because they were just not designed well. I think we can improve and iterate on existing programs. Like, that 3-year cost share wasn't effective at driving long-term change because it didn't come with this engagement and this understanding of why internally regeneration of my ecosystem is essential for my farm business in the absence of any payment at all. And I think that education, that engagement from a highly qualified, highly trusted technical assistance provider, I think if we just have more of that, you can take any farmer if they're interested on this journey to understanding why regeneration and why sustainability is essential for their business.
Yeah, thank you. And I think we all have a lot of hope that the corporate food companies are going to save us, but that's just not how it works, because we have a lot of our own constraints at a food company, and we might not even be a US company. And so what is our role in fixing US agriculture, right? Zach, I remember, the story that you first told me when we met about the way feed moves in Iowa. And I think it would be really helpful if you could just kind of share that briefly, because the consumer doesn't understand that if you're growing grain on your crop or on your farm, that grain has a long journey before it comes back to your farm to feed your animals. And when we think about what collaboration needs to happen along the supply chain, what does that look like in Iowa for most farms? And why will this be really difficult to kind of bring the consumer along and care about it the way the system is today?
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. So just to give an example of the path of my corn or my soybeans. So my corn goes down the road about 13 miles to an ethanol plant and gets turned into ethanol or DDGs, which then get on another truck and likely go to a cattle feedlot, anywhere from 60 to 100 miles away and end up in the belly of a cow. My soybeans go about 65 miles northwest of me, go to a processing plant there, get turned into oil and meal. The meal gets shipped usually to a feed mill somewhere and then gets shipped out to a hog confinement, which can go another 60 to 100 miles. So there's just a lot of movement of stuff all over the place and movement of animals all over the place. And we didn't used to have that, when I was a little kid, a lot of farmers, grew their own feed components and ground them on the farm themselves and fed them to their own animals, and they walked things off. And we've really lost that. We've become incredibly specialized. So as far as how to connect the consumer to that, I don't know. To me, I don't know why the consumer is pumped about that. And I wish I could make the story more fun, but I think that's why there has to be some substantial change to reconnect these things, so the consumer looks at it and says, aha, I like that. And until ag figures out to get some aha factor, rather than just saying, just trust us, we know what we're doing, I think we got a lot of work to do.
And you have a social media presence, you do some direct marketing, consumers. What do they tell you they value? Is it just the relationship? Is it the quality? Is it a little bit of everything?
A little bit of everything, but one of the things I've tried to build into my system that's different from, so my new system is producing, regeneratively produced livestock in a multi-species or species arrangement. One of the things I do is I put a live stream cam on Facebook every night. We broadcast exactly what our animals are doing, and we would talk about everything that was going on. And you know, transparency, I think that's what they want to see. I don't think they have those options, and those things are out there. We just haven't figured out the ways to really communicate directly in the way that the consumer wants to. And I don't say I wouldn't say that I've got it all figured out. There's things that we can optimize to really get better engagement, but it's going to be things like that, I think, that get the trust and consumers buying in, where they're maybe willing to pay a premium if they can see that traceability back to the farm.
And Christy, for you, you know, in the commodity system, you know, in soybeans, I'm curious, where do your products go when they leave the farm? And, you know, is there an opportunity to, you know, help the consumer see more value in the work that you're doing?
Yeah, right now I mean, when we cut our grain, we take it to a local elevator. It's 15 to 20 miles, and they store it, dry it, put it on a barge, and from there it goes to all parts of the world. I would like if our consumers could be more involved, especially like we grow rice and it does the same thing. It goes all parts of the world. Unlike, you know, most of the farmers in California that grow rice, it actually stays within their state because they have such a large Asian population. That's not the case here. You know, our rice is going who knows where. We don't. And I mean, I would like if we could get to a point where the consumer would know where the farm it was coming from and that they were having sustainable practices on their farm. I think some of the vegetable farmers have a unique opportunity to do that because people are actually, you know, buying organic and stuff like that. I think one of the things that farmers in my area get a lot of heat from is, you know, the highly use of pesticides and dicamba. And where I am, it's even with the regulations, Mississippi isn't as strict as a lot of other states, surrounding states like Arkansas. I think we're basically at a point where we grew some non-GMO last year for a company and saw some really good benefits from the premiums that were worth it. But you almost have to grow dicamba tolerant crops or you won't be growing anything because it will be drifted on you. So I think I'm hopeful for the future that we'll get to a point where our consumers can be more involved in what we're growing. But right now, it's really hard to think that far.
Yeah, the opacity in the supply chain is goes both ways. Yeah. Caleb, in the dairy space and in Vermont, where place-based marketing is a really big thing, you know, people think of Vermont and there's all these black and white cows all over the landscape and it's all perfect. But, you know, what do you wish the consumer valued about what you're doing and your operation?
I guess I wish they would value that like a family is making a living on a small farm and what that means. And yeah, like there are more efficient ways to do it, but like you take all of us away and like suddenly the place where I live turns into New Hampshire or it turns into somewhere like totally different where like it doesn't have the same fabric. And so yeah, I mean, that's a lot of times I think about like what percentage of retail price would it take to, how much of that would a farmer have to get back to make the difference? And obviously it's different with everything you would grow or sell or whatever, but like it's such a small number that like, man, like people don't have to value it a whole lot. They just got to value it a little bit to make a big difference.
Yeah, that's very true. And I think in a lot of the corporate sustainability work we do, we're constantly asking, well, what are the costs of production? I mean, there's economists across hundreds and hundreds of economists across the country estimating cost of production, you know, but I've started to hear some farms say, okay, I'm willing to share a little bit more, but, you know, food company, would you share back? And, you know, these are just very big paradigm shifting questions to be asking. And I think it's an interesting shift that farmers are feeling slightly empowered to say, I'm willing to name a price if you are too. And it's also a challenge because then everyone shows up to the table negotiating, right? And so where's the collaborative spirit when we kind of approach it from that market base? But there are a lot of different ways that we're trying to figure these out. And is it 1% per cup goes to this, matching funds to that, but getting that money delivered to the farm is far more challenging than anyone would ever realize. For the, what Christy kind of just highlighted is that she cuts the grain, it goes on a barge. And that grain is commingled with dozens and hundreds of other farms. And we are not going to be in a place where we can build traceability all the way down to that farm level. And so there's a lot of ways that we rely on mass balance and modeling to get there. And as soon as you do that, you got a bunch of folks coming in, looking at a model and critiquing a model rather than paying attention to the premise. The point of us being here is to keep farmers whole, allow them to keep innovating. So I want to, before we open up to questions from the audience, so audience, if any of you have some questions, please put them into the Q&A. I'd like to go to everybody now. So I think we can all agree that it's not one entity's responsibility to change the system. And we need to reinvent the policy agenda so that we can drive rapid, scalable adoption of these conservation ag practices. And I think we can acknowledge that our public institutions, they need to shift from this focus on efficiency and productivity. And we've crushed that. We're good. Like, we can grow a lot of everything in the United States. Like, we're doing a wonderful job there. But shifting these structures and these systems, these institutions, to focus on sustainability, regeneration, climate resiliency, and equity, this is a big change. And so I'm curious, in your community, it could be a local change, it could be a community, county, national. What is one policy change that you think would unlock the innovation potential for your farm and for your community? I'm going to see if anybody wants to volunteer to go first this time.
I will.
Thanks.
And I've already hit on it. I think it's crop insurance. I think that is it's the thing that none of the farm groups want to talk about and farmers don't want to yield on, but it's really where the rubber meets the road. And at least in corn and soybean country, it dictates stuff. And I think if you want to unleash innovation, you have to put risk back into this business. And you need to have a way for farmers that are innovative and can achieve efficiencies with this thing to have a chance to get ahead and be rewarded for that. And rather than everybody always coming out to about this level and we just kind of trudge on and change doesn't happen. And so from a policy, I know I've said it a couple times tonight, but I honestly think it's going to be a very hard thing to do, but it's probably the most efficient vehicle that we can change to get innovation kicking and true market risk introduced back into what we do.
Thank you. Interesting. Do I have a second person who wants to go? I will start calling on you, but.
I think for me, it really hits home because, just being a part of the National Black Growers Council, our mission is to have efficiency, productivity, and sustainability. And, so now I'm starting to think maybe we should be leaving the efficiency and the productivity because we've kind of mastered that. You can make a lot off a little of land, with all the technology and the machinery. So maybe we should be moving our motto towards sustainability, regeneration, and climate resiliency. I kind of like that. Maybe that will be our new motto. But as a Black farmer, I think policy is one of the things that we're trying to really implement. I don't, if y'all heard the Justice for Black Farmers Act with Cory Booker. I think on a policy level is where we can really make the most change. We're already being really productive on the little land we have, but if we could just move the envelope a little bit further, and that act not only just helps current farmers, but future farmers. So like, investing in land grant universities and HBCUs and teaching them sustainable practices before they get on the farm. So maybe they'll already know about them, as opposed to I just came to the farm and then start learning about sustainability. I think if it was on their radar when they were ag majors, that, we could really push the needle a little bit further.
Yeah. I think we're all hopeful that the Justice for Black Farmers Act, goes through and is as effective as the purpose of it is.
Mm-hmm.
Linda?
I'm going to touch on something that hasn't been mentioned yet tonight, but it has been mentioned, but not specifically as a policy issue, land ownership, right? So the consolidation of land into very few hands. And as farmland is sold, it's being purchased a lot by investors, right? We keep hearing how much farmland Bill Gates owns. Well, I don't want Bill Gates to own farmland, right? I want a farmer to own farmland. And I don't know how we change that with policy, but there are some innovative work being done by some NGOs to try to purchase farmland and then sort of lease it to farmers on a rent to own kind of basis to beginning and new farmers. And I think there's some potential there for some equity and justice, but also just really diversifying who owns land, but making sure that people who own the land are the people farming the land, because we know that people who own land look after it much better than people who rent land, right? Just like people who rent an apartment don't take the same care of it as people who own their own house. So I would like us to think in that direction a little bit with some of our policies.
Yeah, that's a really interesting one. Isn't it something like at least 40, if not 60% of the land in the Midwest is rented? And if you want to do conservation practices, what motivation do you have to put that on ground? Even if you've got a 10-year or a 17-year relationship, if you are working on really small margins and you're worried about that land getting pulled from you next year, it's very hard to justify to yourself or your farm manager or whoever's keeping your books to put another $40, $50 per acre down. Now we do see farms throwing a lot of nitrogen down, but go back to that crop insurance question and you'll understand how that's more easy to justify to them. There was also recently, I think it was late last year, an article saying that foreign entities own as much land as Ohio in the United States. And, if you go to the Colorado River Basin, which is a huge region of alfalfa and grass hay production, Saudi Arabian entities own a massive amount of land growing alfalfa that's moving on to moving to horse farms in the Middle East. And I think if Americans knew this, they would be willing to say, hey, wait, I could see a policy shift here that would really help keep land in the hand of farmers, maybe do a little repatriation, and make sure that we have the American farmer kept whole. Let's see, Steve, and I'm being jumped on you. I know you're a soil scientist at a food company, but you've been in this space for a long time. What's the policy change you think that would really help unlock innovation?
Yeah, I agree with everything that's been said today. I think, one piece that I've hit on already is just we have 2 million individual farms in the US, and every single one of those could use help, like a coach, a technical assistance provider, to make more effective decisions in the sustainability space. And so just greatly expanding the workforce that is doing technical service providing, conservation service providers. I think we just need a lot more of those people and a lot, better pay for those people so that it's a job that people want to actually do, highly qualified people want to do, and stay in that role and can build relationships with farmers in their community and really kind of build this movement. I think that's really where we see a lot of traction in sustainability, is when there's a really awesome person in that conservation district or in that extension office that has just got a lot of farmers in their area excited about this stuff and is effective at moving them in this direction. And so how do we just grow that workforce and grow the potential and capacity of people that are already in those positions to just really be catalysts for innovation and change? So I don't know how we do that, but let's get more people like that.
Let's get to it, however we do that. So Caleb, last but not least, what do you think is a policy intervention that would help unlock innovation?
Yeah. I'm not sure about the answer to that question, but what kind of ties into it that I was just thinking about is hearing Steve talk, is it's so much easier to do a good job when you're getting paid. And like that's something that I think that people don't like. Food is cheap. And I don't think people always put that together, that like it's hard to do innovative, progressive things. Like if you're just barely scraping by, like you're not gonna take the risks or like try those new ideas, like because you just can't. And so somehow we've got to come up with a way that like those steps in the right direction just get easier to take. I'm not sure what that looks like. It may be made of 20 different things. I don't know.
Yeah, and I think it probably is hundreds of tiny little hammers, because there's no silver bullet in agriculture. We've seen this before. It's grit, it's hard work, it's people, it's relying on humans, it's building up capacity, it's improving our public institutions, it's building trust. It's everything that everybody else does in their work every day, and making sure that it works and functions in our agricultural systems. I'm going to quick over to the Q&A, see if there's some stuff there we can pull. Are there any kind of final thoughts, or did anybody have a question for another panelist that you wanted to pose?
I'd kind of like to ask Zach how he moved to 100% cover crop like that. I think that's so awesome, because to be honest, we started doing cover crop because of conservation practices that we were getting paid for, and then moved on just to keep doing it, but not to necessarily expand to the level, And I've seen a lot of people that I know that have done some cover crops and saw some great benefits especially with water management. Like irrigation is a big thing here, and I've seen some irrigated versus some non-irrigated, and the non-irrigated had a cover crop and it yielded the same amount due to the cover crop helping keep some of the moisture in the soil. So I just would like to, ask how he moved to 100% cover crop.
Yeah, so really good question. Like I said, I'm in a different situation, the fact that I farm all family owned ground. So I have the privilege of looking on a very long look basis, because I know I'm going to farm my ground for a long time, and there's not a lot of people that are in that position. So with that said, cover crops are a long-term investment, and you can't just do them for a year or two and expect that you're going to have this magical result. And so I made the commitment to it, and there's years that I've lost money doing it and I haven't had great results, and that's the reality. It's not like cover crops are some magical elixir that cures everything, but over the long term, if you stay at it and you learn, I've seen the benefits in 8 years already, significant benefits in water infiltration, and just the way my ground smells in March when things start to thaw out. There's a difference when the biology is kicked into gear. And from a weed suppression standpoint, I don't have issues like a lot of my neighbors do with herbicide resistant species, because my cover crop is helping suppress those weeds. And so there's just all those things that, it's a pain. I mean, I don't like having to go out and seed my cover crops every year, and I don't like some of the extra steps, but it's a long-term look. And my situation helps me do that more. And I understand why other people, if you're in a rental situation, it doesn't work. But that's the problem with ag right now, where everything is based off of what's the result of the next quarter, or how do we get by and pay our note off this year. And that's like, we have a 1-year goal post we're trying to kick through. And that's what's so backwards about everything, because it's not, it's what are we going to have soils and a food system in 50 or 100 years that are going to be worth a hoot to actually produce something. And big agriculture wants to pump the idea of technology more, and it's a fallacy. And so that's why a really long-winded answer of why I use cover crops, because I think it's part of that solution to keep my soils resilient. My soils are what the value is
Right.
And I want to maintain that.
Amen. I think you summed
Sorry.
it up really, really well.
Yeah.
No, I think we can all, anybody who's working in space goes, yep, that's
Mhm.
it. I mean, we've talked about like multi-year financial planning with farms, like who's got that? Well, why would you need that? You know, how would we even figure out how to use that? So, and yet we've got a system that is on one's hand is telling us what's your 10-year plan? How are you going to manage for that? How are you going to make sure that carbon stays in your soil? And on the other hand, your bank wants their money back in 9.5 months. So it's a tough system working. There are a few questions in the chat, but I realize we are at time. So, you know, we see your questions. They're about, you know, so food loss and food waste. That's not exactly how farms would talk about it. They're very efficient. They sell everything they can. That food waste is at kind of the retail food service space. And there's some stuff happening in dairy around methane digesters and bringing food waste into that, but I think it's a little too complicated for us to get to today. But some really nice questions, and I think you guys have done a fantastic job of kind of touching on them and addressing them. And so to the Yale team organizers, I think we can turn it back over to you guys, but you know, Linda, Steve, Caleb, Christy, Zach, thank you so much for joining me in this conversation. I really enjoyed learning from you, hearing your perspectives, and just thanks for doing your work and sticking with it, and you know, trying to find the positive in all this and sharing your story with others, because I think it's going to be really important as we help to normalize this and bring more farmers into conservation ag practices. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Yeah, and thanks, Caleb, Christy, Zach. It was great hearing your stories. I enjoyed listening to you all.
All right, thank you so much. I'm so grateful to all of you for your time this evening, panelists, and thank you for dealing with the Zoom technical issues and everything. And thank you so much, Jessie, for your moderation. I am about to put a link in the chat. I'm just pulling that up here so that for anyone who wants, we can continue into a normal Zoom room where the participants and everyone can see one another and keep chatting about some of these issues for about 30 more minutes. So I'm going to pop that up now. And if anyone wants to join, please do. Otherwise, thank you so much and have a great evening.